So let's begin. Our first speaker today is Erin Leach, who's Special Collections and Cataloging Librarian at the University of Georgia Library. She's going to be providing us a little ground setting and level setting. So Erin, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. You can pull up your slides and you can kick things off.
Great, thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction, Todd, so thank you for that. I should say that I'm a Zoom novice, so many thanks to Jill for the orientation, and hopefully things go smoothly. So good afternoon, everyone. For those of us who don't know each other, my name is Erin Leach, and I'm the Special Collections Cataloging Librarian for the University of Georgia Libraries. I'm thrilled that I was invited to speak to you this afternoon, and I'm grateful to NISO for the opportunity to speak with a panel of such distinguished colleagues. The topics that I like to think about and write about most often are building relationships between technical services library workers and public services library workers, storytelling as a vehicle for conveying the value of well-formed metadata, and the role of lived experience in metadata creation, which is the reason I've been invited to speak to you today. In addition to being a cataloger, I'm also a first-year PhD student at the University of Georgia's Institute of Higher Education, where I think a lot about academic freedom and the role of academic libraries in the higher education ecosystem. Identifying and naming positionality has become important to me in my early days as a qualitative researcher. Positionality is the notion that no research, especially qualitative research, can be free of the researcher's values and experiences. Acknowledging positionality doesn't remove a researcher's values and experiences from the work they do. In fact, it foregrounds them. And by foregrounding our values and experiences, we can ensure that our work is trustworthy to those who consume it. It's in this spirit that I wanted to start my talk by sharing a positionality statement. First, I want to acknowledge my own personal biases. I am a cisgender, able-bodied, middle-class white woman. I cannot escape these identities, and they shape my experiences and my view of the world. Second, I want to acknowledge my theoretical positionality. I'm a postmodernist. This means I reject the notion of objective truth and instead believe that the idea of truth is socially constructed within a historical context. I think knowing that about me helps you understand where I'm coming from in the rest of my remarks. In addition to acknowledging my positionality, I want to acknowledge the people whose lives and works have had a substantial impact on my formulation of ideas about bias and neutrality and metadata creation. It's my belief that nobody, well, very few people, come to a place of understanding about a topic on their own. Instead, they stand on the shoulders of the giants who have come before them. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the people upon whose shoulders I stand when it comes to thinking about these questions. So the question that brings us all here this afternoon, the moment you've all been waiting for, is the question, can there be neutrality in cataloging? Based on what you already know about me, or what you just learned about me in the previous few slides, it should come as no surprise that my answer is no. As an aside, the downside of a webinar is that you can't notice the audience's reaction. So I do hope you're laughing at this slide. I give you permission to laugh, go ahead. So while you're laughing at my funny slide, let's take a moment to think about what makes the answer to this "can there be neutrality in cataloging" question complicated. I'm not just going to say no and be finished. The abstract of my talk states that I'll be using critical discourse analysis as a lens through which to view metadata creation. Never fear if you don't know anything about critical discourse analysis. I've got you covered. The next couple of slides provide an orientation to this theoretical framework. This is only meant to be a high-level overview, as time constraints mean I can't examine all of the nuances of this particular theoretical framework. However, if what you learn from my talk interests you, I encourage you to take the time to learn more about this theory. Okay, so critical discourse analysis, what are we talking about? So critical discourse analysis lives at the intersection of language and social structures. Critical discourse analysis researchers are especially interested in problematizing the relationship between language and social structures, not just identifying that these relationships exist. Essentially, critical discourse analysis suggests that language is not and cannot be neutral because it exists in both a historical and social context. While the title of my talk, Power, Corruption, and Lies, is a tip of the cap to an album by synth pop band New Order, and bonus points if you pick that up, it's worth acknowledging that as we use critical discourse analysis as a lens through which to view the question, can there be neutrality in cataloging, we'll be forced to reckon with some pretty uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and about our role as metadata creators in perpetuating systems and structures that privilege the points of view of certain people over others. So just get comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable. It's also useful to understand that critical discourse scholars are not content to uncover the relationships between language and social structures in a given context. Like many theories that are born of the critical theory tradition, the end game of critical discourse analysis is to bring about social change by exposing abuses of power and giving voice to those whose voices have been erased. Noted critical discourse analysis scholar Michael Halliday put forward a model in which he suggested that a text has three contexts. Each context makes use of the word discourse, which in the context of our conversation today can be understood to mean written text. The first context, field of discourse, refers to what a text is about. The second context, tenor of discourse, is concerned with the various participants in a text and their various roles and relationships to one another. The third context, mode of discourse, is concerned with the function of a text, including its organization and medium. While there are certainly concerns about neutrality and descriptive cataloging, I want to focus my remarks today on subject cataloging, paying particular attention to controlled vocabulary and thesauri. So when considering Halliday's model, we can think of the thesaurus as a text. The next few slides will use Halliday's model as a way to organize our thinking about neutrality and bias in metadata creation. So let's start at the very beginning, which, as I understand it, is a very good place to start. The first of Halliday's contexts is field of discourse. So let's think about what our text is about. I'm going to use the words controlled vocabulary and thesaurus a lot during this talk. So we're all on the same page. I want to start by offering a definition of each of these words. A controlled vocabulary is a standardized list of terms used to organize knowledge. The terms included in a controlled vocabulary may or may not have a relationship to one another. A thesaurus is a type of controlled vocabulary where terms have relationships to each other. There are three types of relationships. Hierarchical relationships, so terms are broader or narrower. Associative relationships, so terms are related, they're siblings, so they belong to different hierarchies. And equivalencies, where terms are synonymous and where one term can be used in place of another. When considering what our text is about, I would suggest that a thesaurus is about words and the relationship between these words. Some thesauri, such as Getty's Art and Architecture Thesaurus, or the rare book and manuscript section's binding terms, the words are specific to a topic or field of study. But other thesauri, like Library of Congress subject headings or Sears list of subject headings, are not organized around a particular topic or field of study. Now that we've thought about what our text is about, let's turn our attention to the second of Halliday's contexts, tenor of discourse. Tenor of discourse is related to the participants in the text. With regard to the use of controlled vocabulary and metadata creation, I believe that there are two types of participants: those who are the keepers of controlled vocabulary and the metadata creators who are the consumers of controlled vocabulary. Let's start by talking about the keepers of controlled vocabulary. Generally speaking, thesauri that are widely used in library work were created by and are maintained by institutions. For example, the keeper of the Library of Congress subject headings is the Library of Congress Acquisitions and Bibliographic Access Directorate's Policy and Standards Division. The resources available to institutions make them appealing candidates to serve as caretakers of controlled vocabulary because many individuals or collectives of volunteers lack the time, money, and personnel required to adequately develop and maintain thesauri. Having institutions act as keepers of controlled vocabulary is not without its downsides, most notably that individual members of user communities have less control over how a given thesaurus grows and changes over time. In many cases, members of user communities can propose additions to a thesaurus, but must be trained to do so. And in many cases, the proposal process is highly structured and rigorous. While having systems and structures in place to guide the proposal process ensures integrity, doing so also limits the number of people who can contribute to a thesaurus, because member institutions who want to contribute must have the material resources to train and support their metadata creators. In the age of doing more with less, enhancements of a nationally used thesaurus in service of well-formed metadata is not often the top priority because it has limited impact on the local user community. Having a limited number of voices involved in the development of controlled vocabulary means that the rate of change to terms in a thesaurus is often slow, and that the number of points of view included in those changes are limited. When we talk about metadata creators as consumers of controlled vocabulary, we get to the heart of the reason the answer to the question, can there be neutrality in cataloging, is so complicated to answer. When we consider metadata creators and their relationship to controlled vocabulary, perhaps the most important factor we have to consider is how the lived experiences of metadata creators influence the work that we do. And any conversation about the lived experience of metadata creators has to include an acknowledgement of the demographics of librarianship. According to a report published by the American Library Association, in 2009-2010, 88% of credentialed librarians were white. And according to that same report, 82% of those white librarians were women. I'm not the first person to suggest this, and I hope I'm not the last. Whiteness is not just the demographic norm in librarianship, but also the cultural norm. And until we reckon with how our demographics shape our field's worldview, we will not have true equity and inclusion in librarianship. When it comes to the development and application of thesauri, whiteness as the cultural norm means that we are often unable to see the ways in which the words used to describe library resources are othering and damaging to our colleagues and library users of color, because they aren't othering and damaging to us in the same way. And because we are unable to fully understand the experiences of our colleagues and library users of color, despite our best intentions, we may find ourselves perpetuating socially stratified systems, even when we don't mean to. Malik Matthew, assistant professor of sociology at the University of Cincinnati, put words to this phenomenon in a recent tweet stating, "Well-intentioned people often perpetuate systems of inequality with no malice yet full effects." In addition to talking generally about the ways in which whiteness as the cultural norm in librarianship impacts how the field sees itself in the world, we also need to talk about how the lived experience of individual metadata creators impacts how we interpret metadata creation standards. As metadata creators, we are familiar with the idea of cataloger's judgment. But in case you're not, cataloger's judgment means that while a rule is meant to be applied uniformly, as a cataloger, I may choose to interpret it differently from another cataloger. In much the same way that a cataloger's understanding of cataloging rules and local user needs influences their application of those rules, a cataloger's understanding of their place in the world influences how they utilize controlled vocabulary to describe a library resource. While I may not intentionally insert my views into my cataloging work, I'm never able to fully separate myself from my lived experience as a white, cisgender, able-bodied, middle-class woman. Thus, my views are embedded in every choice that I make about how to apply controlled vocabulary. So while cataloger's judgment is a useful way to describe the flexibility of cataloging rules, I would argue that the cataloging community should also consider adding cataloger's bias to its lexicon. Halliday's final context is mode of discourse. So let's look at what our text is being asked to do. So I guess before I continue, I should say I love song lyrics, so I had to put a little song lyric Easter egg in here. So bonus points if you knew that was a Modest Mouse song. Having said that, I'd like to suggest that controlled vocabulary's primary purpose is to organize and arrange knowledge so that it can be retrieved later. So our text, a thesaurus, is being asked to provide a way for those tasked with organizing and describing information to describe it and build relationships between concepts and texts. The good news about this is that controlled vocabulary promotes consistency. Generally speaking, all material on a given topic should be assigned the same term from a thesaurus. It's remarkable, actually, when you consider the fact that metadata creators from different types of libraries from different parts of the world can use a thesaurus to successfully assign terms that describe a resource in a consistent way so that people they may never meet can access these resources at a later time. In fact, if you ask me, it's probably the idea I find most compelling about metadata creation. But while we're all feeling enamored with how useful a thesaurus is for helping metadata creators and library users make sense of the world, let's also acknowledge that controlled vocabulary reifies a particular worldview. It may be helpful to know that Merriam-Webster defines reifying as, quote, to give definite context and form to a concept or idea, unquote. The worldview that controlled vocabulary reifies is one where white men have power. When searching Library of Congress subject headings, often it is women and people of color, especially women of color, who are singled out with a special heading. For example, when searching the authority file for the heading authors, I noticed that the default idea of author is that of a white man. Other kind of authors, for example, African American authors or women authors, are given special specific subject headings. The reification of the worldview where white men have a surfeit of power causes our colleagues and library users from marginalized communities visceral pain, and for them, the library becomes yet another place where they are the other. So, controlled vocabulary. Good news for people who love bad news. Because controlled vocabulary is created and utilized by fallible people whose work is imbued with their lived experiences, I do not believe there can be neutrality in cataloging. See, I told you it was complicated. So if neutrality isn't possible, what do we do? I have a few ideas. First, consider which institutions created the thesauri we use most often in describing library resources, as well as those who have been designated the thesauri keepers. Consider what systems and structures these institutions represent and what systems of oppression they work to uphold. Consider the process of proposing additional terms for a thesaurus. Identify if there is opacity in the process, and think about how that opacity benefits the institutions who have been designated as keepers of controlled vocabulary. If the proposal process is limited to people with certain kinds of training, consider what may be gained or lost by having only certain members of a community equipped to contribute to a thesaurus's development. Second, look at controlled vocabulary with an eye toward which worldviews are reified. Look at whose existence is the default when it comes to terminology, whose existence is called out specifically, and whose existence is never named. Consider the ways in which the reification of these worldviews may be othering to your colleagues and library users from marginalized communities. Finally, reflect on your positionality as a metadata creator. Identify the different parts of your identity, noting which parts are privileged and which are marginalized. You can use the positionality statement I shared earlier as a template to do your own work. Reflect on the idea that your identities, views, and values do not exist outside yourself and cannot easily be shed when it comes time to do your work of describing library resources. In much the same way that identifying and naming positionality makes qualitative research more trustworthy, I would like to suggest that doing so can also make our metadata creations more trustworthy as well. If the goal of critical discourse analysis is to both understand the relationship between language and social structures and to disrupt them in the name of greater equity, it can also be said that the goal of critically conscious cataloging should be to understand the relationship between controlled vocabulary and social structures in an effort to disrupt subject cataloging in the name of greater equity. Reflexivity about our own positionality and a critical examination of the historical and social contexts that influence the creation and keeping of thesauri are important parts of the disruption process. So I want to share with you a quote from Emily Drapinski's remarks at the 2018 American Library Association's Midwinter President Program that Todd mentioned in his opening remarks. As Todd mentioned, the theme of the event was, "Are libraries neutral? Have they ever been? Should they be?" And Emily's remarks focused on the ideas of neutrality and materiality. This quote from Emily's remarks feels especially urgent and relevant to the question we have been brought here today to consider. Emily writes, "Those steeped in and rewarded by dominant ways of seeing the world don't have to know how intensely political the ostensibly neutral position is. If the white supremacists booking your meeting space are not after you, you don't have to know how dangerous they are. Books about reparative therapy for gay people can be simply another point of view if yours is not the body and mind those authors seek to destroy. To imagine that neutrality could be something we could choose is an intensely privileged position, one that I have to imagine my way into as I listen to the arguments of those absolutists whose worlds are rarely contested." I think Emily's remarks help us understand why the question of neutrality and bias in metadata creation is important for us to consider, but also to understand how those conversations that we're having also have real life implications for our colleagues and our library users. Also, I hope you laugh at this slide as well, so I give you permission. In our few minutes together this afternoon, I hope that I have provided you with a new way to think about the world and your place in it. I hope that my remarks made you feel discomfort, as that's where real growth starts. If I could leave you with one thought to carry with you, it would be this. If the conversation about neutrality and cataloging interests you, and you don't know where to join in, start by considering how your identity and your lived experience shape how you understand your place in the world. So I probably should have started with a picture of myself, but instead I'm finishing with a picture of myself. I've included my contact information, both my email address and my Twitter username. If you have a question or concern you don't feel comfortable sharing in the official Q&A, or if you'd just like to share your thoughts on the topic, you're warmly invited to get in touch with me. Thank you so much for your time and attention and for the opportunity to speak on a topic that's so important to me.
Great, thank you, Erin. Great, great presentation, great talk, and a nice kind of level setting for this conversation. I'm just wondering, in terms of and I encourage all of those who are on the line to use the Q&A functionality. We log questions. You can type them in at any time. Welcome any questions for Erin or any of the other upcoming speakers. I was wondering, to what extent have you been having these conversations in your own institution, and what has been the feedback and what's been the kind of reaction to these ideas at your own institution? Are you kind of lone voice? Are you?
Sure. So I think that there are definitely people in my organization who are interested in these concepts, but I think one thing that becomes apparent when you hear me talk is that it's often hard to translate some of these ideas into the real world because we're often being asked to do more with less, and my institution is no exception to that rule. And so sometimes it's hard to make space to really have those hard conversations or to implement those ideas. But I think we're all thinking a little bit more about who we are and about the ways in which we can make our work more accessible to our users. But I think it's important to think about making space to have those conversations. And I think that's something that we're trying to do.
And another great question came in from one of our attendees. To what extent have you used controlled vocabularies or thesaurus from other cultures or countries in your work, and how have you incorporated them or could you recommend any that would be useful to kind of bring in different perspectives into the cataloging work you've done?
So most of the work I do ends up being thesauri that are not sort of community driven. I use a lot of Library of Congress subject headings, the Getty's Art and Architecture thesaurus, and then some of the RBMS controlled vocabulary. I think the thing that's challenging about choosing to venture outside of those sort of more mainstream controlled vocabularies is that when you're creating and reusing metadata from other sources, it really does require intentionality to move outside and incorporate other controlled vocabularies. I unfortunately don't have a lot to say about to recommend controlled vocabularies. I can certainly sort of do a little bit of poking and get back to whoever the person was that posed that question, and it's possible that that our other speakers may have something to say about that as well. But my interest is sort of in the sort of more mainstream controlled vocabularies and how we can affect change.
Okay. And one more question for you before we have to move on. What do you think about the perspective of more synonyms being added, such as to authority records for LCSH, pending some, updating some stay hidden but still operative, just kind of the notion of expanding the vocabulary with the related terms?
Sure. So I think the more ways, on the sort of fundamental level, the more ways that we can provide entrance for our library users on a particular topic is helpful. So I think sort of making those connections is really important. I think, and one of the people that I mentioned in my talk is Emily Drabinski, has a great article called Querying the Catalog, Queer Theory and the Politics of Correction. And one of the things that she talks about in that article, and it's a thing that I've sort of tried to think about as a cataloger, is in what ways do we as catalogers try to sort of fix or repair the things in the language that we feel are broken, right? So how are we updating our controlled vocabulary? How are we adding synonyms in an attempt to fix those things that we think are broken? And that we like to do that because we want to do the right thing by our users, especially our users from marginalized communities. But sometimes what's more valuable is to show the broken places in our language, and to expose those problematic places. So I think having additional ways into the language is useful, as long as we're not sort of doing that as a way to escape our discomfort as catalogers.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Erin.